You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Travis Norvell, minister at Judson Memorial Baptist Church in Minneapolis, to talk about his book, Church on the Move. We talk about transforming church parking lots, creating bike commute reports for local radio, and how churches changed after the advent of the automobile. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you stickers and a handwritten note with a cool stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our bus-only scarves. Still working on some new designs for scarves and some other cool merch, and looking forward to sharing those with you all soon when they're finished. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire daily newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Well, Travis Norvell, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Jeff. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am American Baptist minister of Judson Memorial Baptist Church in South Minneapolis. I have 3 kids, 2 in college, 1 in high school. And a number of years ago, about 10 years ago almost, I started exclusively, biking, walking, and taking public transit for my job as a pastor.
And what brought that about? I mean, it seems from reading the book that there's many times where you tried to give up your car and then it didn't quite work out. What was the impetus for doing so the first time, initially?
Oh, yeah. So, when I was in 6th grade, I grew up in a little town in West Virginia, and we went to Washington, D.C. for our patrol trip. Patrols, we were the people who helped kids cross the road for school. And so we went to Washington, D.C. We're in the bus, we're driving, and I see for the first time ever a dedicated bike lane. I'm 12 years old, and I think it is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. And I just wanted to have, that to be part of my life. And so when I started working, I kept trying it, and just after almost like a comedic errors, it just wouldn't happen. And then until I moved to Minneapolis in the middle of a polar vortex. So, yeah.
How is it cycling in the cold? I mean, Minneapolis is known for its hardiness of the folks that live there in terms of their biking. So how is that when you have to wake up and it's cold outside and get to work?
Some days it's hellish, I got to be honest with you. But the other days, most of the days it's good. It's at first 2 minutes of biking that's really kind of hard on you. And it makes you want to just have a heated seat. Once your body temperature gets warmed up, it's fine. But it's that first 2 minutes, you're like, come on.
Yeah. Well, now in Minneapolis, your car light, and I was interested by the story that you told of talking to your daughter after sermon of how you were like, yep, well, you know what? I finally need to get rid of this Passat.
Yeah. I was preaching a sermon on Christian socialism, and the question I asked everybody was, what are you willing to sacrifice in your life so that others may experience joy? I'm putting my daughter to bed. At the time, Seneca was 12, and she says, hey, Dad, just innocently, she said, hey, Dad, what do you think you're going to do? To sacrifice so other people can experience joy. And, I just went ashen. I didn't have a response for her. I felt like a complete phony. We talked about environmentalism since she was born. And I was like, okay, I got to do something. So that night I just started researching, how do you bike year round? And what do I need to do to take the bus and walking? And it was also the same time that this Volkswagen Passat that I had, the heater went out on it, and I was tired of just spending thousands of dollars in repairs for it. And I was like, that's it. So I was able to get the heater kind of working enough to sell it. And I took all the proceeds from that and bought the necessary gear for winter biking. And yeah, it was off to the races then.
It's interesting. We share the same kind of story. I mean, when I got rid of my car here in San Francisco, it was about, I think it was like 2012 or so, 2010, something I can't even remember anymore because it feels like such a long time ago. But it was a Volkswagen Jetta. And I was tired of, all the maintenance fees and stuff like that. And also they just instituted a parking permit on my street. And since my car was registered at my grandmother's house, they wouldn't let me get a permit. And then also my clutch was bad. And so I was like, well, this clutch is going to cost the same as the car is worth. And so there's another funny story about who I sold the car to, but that's for another day. And I was like, okay, then I can do this. It was right kind of around the time of, Zipcar was just kind of taking off.
Yeah.
There's other options, other alternatives. There's also, obviously in the Bay Area, it's easy to get on my bike. And I used the proceeds to buy a new bike as well. So I appreciated your story because I felt some kinship in that.
Yeah, and that car, it was obviously I bought it in New Orleans. I found out after I bought it, it had been flooded during Katrina.
Oh no!
Yeah, and so that was part of the problem. The only saving grace of that car was I have this little joke. Whenever I go to a new store or a new place, I'll say, "Hey, it's my first time here. Did I get a free T-shirt? Or maybe like a high five or something." And I went to the Volkswagen place, this little independent shop, and I said, "Hey, did I get a free T-shirt?" And he went, "Who told you about the free T-shirt? Did Dreamer tell you about the free T-shirt? Damn it!" All right, what size do you wear?
Oh, maybe I should start asking.
Yeah, even if you just get a high five, it's worth it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I was hunting news as I do, and I came across your piece that you wrote in the Christian Century about reimagining the church parking lot, which it seems is somewhat of an extension of your book, Church on the Move. When did you first start thinking about the connections between the church and, say, active transportation?
Oh, well, I think I always thought about it. One was just realizing that how many churches have these giant parking lots, for one thing. And the other part was, I've lived in towns where there wasn't public transit near the church. I always thought about, well, wouldn't it be great if the bus went straight by the church? So those are the kind of big ideas. And then also, the late Jay Waljasper, I don't know if you know Jay's work, but Jay lived catty corner from the church. And he told me that, he said, "I'm never going to be a part of a church that has a parking lot." And I just always loved that. And so he got me really thinking about a parking lot, just what used to be there, how it transformed the neighborhood when you put a parking lot and have to tear houses down for the temporary storage of an automobile.
Yeah, and you mentioned that in the book too, the purchasing a property next door and then how many actually spaces you would get out of that. If you just tore down the building, you get 6 spaces or something you said?
At best,
and
right?
It just doesn't seem like it's worth it for 250 square feet of car.
Yeah. And we did kind of the math on what to get the adequate parking off street to move it into a parking lot. I mean, the neighborhood would be destroyed. It wouldn't be the same neighborhood at all. So why are we putting so much energy into a church parking lot that really doesn't service only, I don't know, maybe not even a tenth of the time? You destroy a neighborhood just for this one convenience of being able to park, for a couple hours, one day a week.
And if you have that space, it seems like you can use it for other things as well, I imagine.
Exactly. That was the whole part that I started, well, how can we think more strategically about this? If it is the space that we have, what are the fun things you can do with it? And I think back, I tell a story about a basketball court. There was a basketball court in my hometown that suddenly appeared one morning, and they put 9-foot rims up, which amazed everyone in my hometown. And we lined up for hours to be able to play at this place because you could dunk a basketball on it. And we just thought that was fantastic. And none of us were ever going to be able to dunk on a regulation rim. So we would go down there and play, and we'd start playing on Sunday mornings. And the church is this little tiny Methodist church. They got really mad at us and came out and they'd run us off, and we'd come back and they'd run us off again. And rather than engage us, they only saw us as a nuisance. And I thought, looking back on it now, I'm like, if I had 200 kids voluntarily coming to my church parking lot to play ball, I would do everything I could to engage them, even just to get to make a relationship with them, to get to know them. It was a gold mine for relationships, and yet they viewed us as a nuisance. And I think that's what a lot of people think of their parking lot as. They view it as this private property that only serves, the church. And my thought is, okay, how can the parking lot serve the community? And there's just so many things you can do with it, like a basketball court, or you can grow food in these. I'm getting ready to go right now. In about a few minutes, I have to pick up 10 straw bales. A farmer brought them in, and we're going to do straw bale gardening in our backyard. But you can garden now in straw bales in on top of asphalt and have a really nice return on them. There's labyrinths, there's farmers markets, there's just tons of things you can do in a parking lot.
I think of like a fun Halloween kind of get together or something where you have everybody's dressing up and having fun. Those types of things. Yeah, it just seems like a good idea to think about the other ways you could use the parking lot. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think about how the local neighborhood church has evolved too over time. And, back when, many years ago, I imagine when people started going to church every Sunday, every Saturday, they would be in a neighborhood. There's no cars, obviously, at that point. There are churches everywhere. And so, at the time of this automobility increase, it seems like, some of the churches changed because of the ability to get to places by car and the suburbanization of churches and all those things. I'm interested in that history a little bit, and it was fun to read about in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the car really changed the nature of the church. And I don't think the church was really paying attention to it. All they saw was the benefit without really thinking about the loss of what happened. So, for 1900 years, the church survived and flourished without a car. And then it comes and it enabled what I think happened. The main loss was it enabled churches become neighborhood. So originally they were all neighborhood churches. And then all of a sudden they become these destination places where people from outside the community can drive their car in from the suburbs and come to this neighborhood church and then go back to their suburban homes and not really have any interaction with the neighborhood that they inhabit. And I think that's a big loss for churches. And I think it's for any community, it's not just churches, to be in this situation. And, if you look at the 1950s, churches thrived during that time. We have pictures of Judson Church with 700 people sitting down on in the pews for a regular Sunday. But, those times that was just one little slice of time. And I think that de-neighboring impact really kind of comes out in kind of negative ways now as we're, 50 years removed from that and realizing that you don't even know who your neighbors are. And you wonder why churches are having a hard time reconnecting with people and establishing relationships. And I think the car has done that to us in a micro way and in a macro way.
You know your neighborhood, though. You're out and about. You're going to the local, hangouts and talking with folks and walking a lot. How much has that impacted how you interact with the community?
Oh, it's changed everything about it. I got a new standard I'm trying to use that I don't know. I'm judging if I have a good week or a bad week by how many new dogs I meet. And I think that's it's a pretty good way of doing it. And there's some people in the neighborhood right now. I don't know. There's this one dog and owner, Bart and Buddy. And I don't know who's Bart and who's Buddy. I just know them together. So I just always say them together. But yeah, being in the neighborhood has changed everything. Paul Tillich once said that the culture asks questions and the church answers them. And I think that's kind of a very privileged place to be. I don't think the church has any business answering those kind of questions. I say this. I think one of the problems has been that the church is trying to answer questions that no one's asking. And part of that is because you're not in the neighborhood. You don't know the people around you and you don't really know what's going on. So part of the things I tried to do was just when you're out biking, walking, taking the bus, you learn so much more about the neighborhood. You learn what's on people's hearts and minds, and you can respond to that. Like just a couple of days ago, I went to a Twins game and I rode the bus home from the Twins game back to the house. And a group of guys got on, that were kind of rough looking, honestly. And it was kind of people you didn't want to really make too much eye contact with. But I was just sitting there listening to them, their conversations. And they were talking about their brother that they needed to stop by and check on to make sure he was okay. And there was another guy calling his kid to make sure that he had macaroni and cheese to eat for dinner that night. I think that the part of the thing about the car is that it separates you from humanity and you don't get those kind of interactions. But when you're, on the bus, when you're walking, when you're on your bike, you see people at a human speed and at a human level, and you're really able to engage and hear them in a more authentic way.
It's basically this, we've had various iterations of this, the walkable neighborhood, the new urbanism, and now it's kind of the 15-minute neighborhood is the next term du jour. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like that, though. It's kind of like that ability to go out from the church and visit all the areas around and get to everything you need to get to in a certain amount of time, if you're willing to do so, if you're willing to accept that maybe it might take 10 minutes to walk, but it might be a better trip than it would if 2 minutes in the car.
Yeah, we've defined everything by efficiency, for speed, but there's a lot you can get done, in a walk that you can't do in a car. You may get there quicker, but look at the things you're able to accomplish. I just saw on Twitter the day that the Nevada Department of Transportation chair, she's been reading the high cost of parking on her commute. She takes the bus into work and she's been reading it. And it's just a few pages a day. But I think what a fantastic model to have somebody out there doing. Yeah.
Yeah, a new shoepista.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
Who's part of your church?
This church is primarily a lot of artists, a lot of writers, social workers, teachers. There are a couple of doctors and a couple of lawyers, but it's middle class, kind of service-oriented, people in service-oriented professions.
You talked about how Judson was, there was 700 people, 1,200 people or so, and now it's maybe 120 or so. What's that kind of shift been like? Is it gone from a certain type of parishioner to a different type of parishioner? I'm curious, just kind of the change over time.
I'm sure it has changed. It's always been a little bit on the weird side of life, which for me is a good thing. It was started as kind of a mission church, and they literally picked up the church and moved it about 3 blocks north. So it's always had this kind of, a little bit of we're a little bit different than everybody else. And we've kind of served as the foil when everybody else was trying to maybe, things weren't going so good. They could always blame it on, well, at least we're not like Judson, they can say like that. So we're happy for that,
That sounds like a good thing.
No, it is. It's a great thing. Yeah. I think if you look at the membership at Change, it's a great question. When I look at those pictures, the 700, if you looked at that picture then and now, I would say we're probably a lot less Christian than we were then. Right now, I think people in the 1950s would have identified probably strongly as Christian. And right now, we're probably a third would probably call themselves Christian. It's a lot of people now just really looking for a community. Our church is kind of the last stop that you have on your way out of organized religion. So I think that's probably where it's changed. Yeah.
That's interesting. It seems like, you can still pull people in from that community aspect. I feel like that's something that a lot of people are looking for these days.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I don't think we're a third place, where people are hanging out a lot, but we try to be like maybe the fourth place. That one place maybe you come to, and maybe it's just the only time of the week that you have a little bit of silence or maybe a laugh or just to kind of reconnect with humanity. That's an angle that we're trying to serve. And that seems to have a place in people's lives.
It's interesting. I was reading the text and I felt like it was, you're talking about your congregation and congregation building, trying to go out into the community, but I also felt like it was also a text for movement building or thinking about action in transportation or city building or anything along those lines. It wasn't just necessarily about religion and the church, but you could use this as a way to kind of connect with people overall. And I felt connected to it from that standpoint as well.
That was my big hope. I didn't know if it really happened though. There's a writer called Henry Nouwen, and he once said, the personal can be universal. So my hope was like, okay, could we take a very particular story and would it appeal to other people and other walks of life? And I think this book does kind of serve that. There's a really nice review in Strong Towns about it that kind of went at that angle, right? If you're not religious, what is the purpose of this book? And I thought he made a very beautiful case. I'm a little biased. that this is a way to get to know people and to get to know your neighborhood. You don't have to be a church. You could be a nonprofit. You could just be a community organizer. You could just be a neighborhood group, right? How do we get to know each other? And I think this book kind of gives you a little bit of recipes on how to do that.
There are recipes in there as well.
Yeah, exactly. Which I can't figure out why theology books don't have recipes. All churches have cookbooks, and the whole Bible's all these stories about eating. So why weren't they included?
Yeah, well, yours does. So
yeah, exactly.
You're changing form. Yeah. You're changing form. Well, another thing you mentioned, and talk about food. There's slow food. There's slow cities, and then you talk about slow churches. What does that slow part mean in your context?
It just means that if you're going to be in the relationship, I don't want to say business. If you're going to be in the relationship realm, you can't rush it at all. And if we are trying to, Judson, we're trying to, in the process of renewal, we're not going to do it overnight. And we have to trust that building relationships is going to take time. And you got to trust that putting in that time is going to pay off eventually. So for me, that's the slow part of it. And also the slowness of just the speed that we do things. What if we started thinking of how we get to church in a slow manner? And who do we meet along the way? And how does that change us? And how can we live into this kind of slow lifestyle in the midst of so much speed and efficiency around us?
Another connected thing to that is that idea that for incremental change, it might be 2 to 3% a year. And, this is something that you mentioned as well. And it seems to be that's what people can handle. Whereas if you push too far, you'll get a lot of backlash. And I'm curious where you came up with that number, or if that was just something that came out of your understanding of change, or is it something that's kind of universally known?
Well, I've had some other politicians respond to this. It's something that's used there. That came from an environmental psychologist, Christine Manning. She teaches over at McAllister College. We were having coffee one time and she kind of just told me this. She kind of threw that number out of there, shared it with me. And I started thinking back about, through all my life and pastoral experiences. And I'm like, she's exactly right. If you try too much change at once, people react negatively to it. But if you do too little change at once, people react negatively to it. So if you can find this little sweet spot of pushing people, but not pushing them over, I find that people react pretty well to that. And then when you look over a long time, if you're moving the needle 2 to 3% a year, 10 years, you move things 30%. That's a gigantic leap.
And for your parishioners too, if you mention, say, taking your bike or riding the bus, and thinking about that 2 to 3% change, how does that impact them, and how is their response to that when you first start talking about it? Because I imagine that, in my experience anyway, when you first start talking to folks about this stuff, they're a little bit hesitant, and they might get a little defensive about their automobile and being worried about transit and biking and walking and all those things. But over time, it kind of slowly sinks in. How does that go on with the folks that you talk to on a weekly basis?
I would say it this way, I have been reluctant to be aggressive or even offer it as a viable alternative, taking your bike, walking, busing as part of our life of faith. I didn't want to feel judgmental. I mean, so many times when you mention this, people just automatically react negatively to you. And I just didn't want that to have that as part of our relationship. So I just started writing and wanted to see what would happen. So I just started telling stories from the pulpit or in meetings. Hey, when I was on the bus today, this happened, or I was riding my bike and I met so-and-so, or, I was walking down the street and this happened. And then, the stories, people start craving them. Like, then I would get like, who'd you meet this week? Or what happened this week? Those kind of things. And so, and then people start thinking, well, you get a few people like, that kind of saddle up to you and be like, I really want to ride my bike, but I don't know which route to go from my house to the church. And then you start realizing that, a lot of this is really practical stuff. So that led me to think, okay, it's not just about talking about this, but okay, can we do some workshops on, how do you ride the bus? We make so many assumptions that everybody knows how to ride the bus, and a lot of people don't because they're so intimidated by it. And if you're here in Minneapolis, the numbering system makes no sense at all. There's the 4, the 18, and the 5, which are all going north south on parallel lines. But why is the 18 between the 4 and the 5? Just why? I don't know. Yeah, and people ask me that, and I'm like, well, I can't tell you the answer to that. I just know where they go. Or people want to know, again, about their bikes, and then they tell you that their bike's not working well, and you realize, most bike repairs is the two things, right? Just pump up your tires and oil your chain. If you can do those two things, you can get pretty well most places. So it's just a little bit about just basic bike maintenance, or just helping people. I saw that there's a Muslim cyclist club in Birmingham, UK. And outside of Friday prayers, they have bike racks, not the bike racks, but the things you put your bikes on to work on.
I don't know the name of them, but they're jacks, bike jacks.
Everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. Those things, they have them outside the mosque. And when people come in, they put their bike on one, and these mechanics do a little tune up, and they teach people how to do it. And then they go in for Friday prayers, and they come out and they have their bikes ready. I think why aren't churches doing those kind of things, or synagogues, or any other kind of communities of faith? They kind of encourage people to do that. That's been the one thing changed, is trying to look more on the practical side and then encourage people from that realm. And that's where I started to see the change really start to take place, is where people start asking me, how do I ride the bike? How do I ride the bus? What's the best bike route to get here? Or if you were going to walk from A to B, how would you go? Those kind of things. Or then I just make myself available. Hey, if you want to ride your bike or take the bus or walk, hey, just call me and I'll meet you there, and we'll find it together.
It's interesting how much routine plays into that. People understand a way to do something, and so it's harder to change, to fix up something new, think about a new way to do things. And I think they've found that the best time to get people to think about a new way of traveling is when they move to a new house and they're reorienting themselves. And so the routine that they had maybe at their old place doesn't matter anymore. And so you can kind of start to think about what you can do to actually, get people to make different choices. Or if, the choice that's the best choice might be a different choice. And it's interesting to think about how transit agencies, or anybody for that matter, if somebody moves, one of the best things they might be able to do is send the new house a bus pass, or send them a bike map or something along those lines, and it might make them think about their travel patterns. It's just really interesting to think about how, routine is really something hard to change. Yeah.
And here's where religion plays into it, right? We already have religious seasons where people are just supposed to take on new patterns and new behaviors. We're keeping this on Good Friday. The season of Lent's about to end. We had 40 days to take on a new habit. And a lot of people, here in Minneapolis, that started the 30 days of biking for the month of April. Can you get people to change habits? By just using the religious seasons that are available to you. And I think that's where I'm starting to see some other churches and other faith communities start to maybe integrate their transit choices in the religious calendar.
Do you have a new habit? Is that a tough question?
Well, it's been fascinating this winter. I don't know if you know the book Saving Us by Catherine Hayhoe. She's a climatologist. And she had this wonderful line in there that said, you have to offer people a viable option. You're never going to get anywhere shaming someone to make a change. she said, try to give them a viable option. So I was listening to that, and that was right at the time. It was in January, and I was listening to the Minnesota Public Radio. They were giving the traffic report, and semi jackknife on 35E, or one that I love is like car fire on 280. I mean, I don't like that somebody's car caught on fire, but I'm just amazed that there's so many car fires every morning. So I emailed the NPR person. Her name's Kathy Werzer, and I just said, hey, Kathy, if I provide you bike commute reports, weather conditions, would you share them? And she said, sure, I'll do it. And we both thought it'd be kind of maybe a 2 or 3 day thing. And it took off like hotcakes here in Minneapolis. And people even made it as part of Pledge Week, that we give bike commute reports. And I got emails from other biking communities in Ireland, in Venezuela, in Mexico. I got a couple of people in Vancouver. Somebody was trying to shame someone into Milwaukee, saying if Minneapolis can do it, why can't Milwaukee? So that's been my habit. It's just every morning I get up, I ride my bike, I look at the situations, and then come back and make myself and now about 10 other people share their bike commute reports from around the Twin Cities.
So how does that work? How does that work when you do a bike commute report? So you ride your route that you usually ride, or maybe a street over or something along those lines, and then you say, okay, well, there's some black ice here, or there's a problem with hasn't been plowed, that type of thing.
No, exactly, yeah. And at first for me, like because of the pandemic, my work schedule's changed. So I do like it's kind of like I'm in The Hobbit, right? This is my second breakfast, right? This is my second commute. So I will do an early commute. I'll just go out and assess situations, and then I'll come back and say, hey, it looks like the bike paths are clear. The bike lanes have crud on them. Be wary of, a lot of major intersections, that kind of stuff. And then other people will commute in, who commuted in that morning will then say, hey, on the Shelby Avenue Bridge, there's lots of ice, be careful. Somebody else will say on the Hiawatha Trail, there's, this small lake that's frozen over, watch out. So it's kind of like that. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, churches have budgets, families have budgets, businesses have budgets, and they make decisions based on, what they can fit into the budget. How does transportation for the church fit into the budget equation?
Oh, I'm not afraid to say this. When I came to the church, we were in debt pretty bad. We had some deaths in the family and those kind of things, and, some unforeseen financial circumstances. And it seemed kind of bizarre to sell the car in the middle of all that. But that was probably the healthiest financial decision myself and our family made. And then I started adding it up. How much were we spending per month on transit? And it was mind blowing. And after about 18 months, my family and I, for the first time in our family life and our marriage life, we were debt free, all from just, not having a car. How many times you talk to people and they say, well, I'd like to take the bus, but it's $250 a ride, or, the bus pass is $40 a month. I don't know. You hear those kind of arguments all the time. And I understand that. But now I'm like, well, yeah, but if you took the car out of the picture, and you're not paying for gas, you're not paying for maintenance, you're not paying for insurance. There's also just like the mental health part of it. And the health part. We had a gym membership, for crying out loud. And we would drive our car to the gym and then go work out. And now we're like, well, we ride our bikes. That's our workout. And what do they call it? Accidental exercise. I think there was a term for it. Going from A to B, riding your bike. We get a lot of steps in. We get a lot of calories burned.
There's that funny picture that a lot of folks show at conferences, urban planning conferences, which is like the 24-hour fitness, and then they have the escalator going up to the 24-hour fitness. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Your kids have followed you as well. I was interested to hear about your allowances, and especially when they turned 16. That was really fascinating to me, especially as, in my family, basically when we went to college after your first year, Dad would help us buy kind of half a car. We'd have to pay, we'd work through the summers and we'd pay for the other half to get around, but we were away from home. And so it was a way to get around in a suburban kind of environment. But yours is, way more, I don't know if progressive is the right word, but more active transportation focused.
Yeah. I had a high school teacher that used to kind of berate us. She'd be like, okay, why are you getting a job? And somebody would say, so I can pay for the car. And they were like, okay, why do you have the car? So I can get to the job. And she was just like, do you not see the fallacy in this? They always kind of stuck in my head. And so the kids are, they're getting close to 16, and I could, I hear the chatter and the emphasis on the car. And I'm like, okay, look, we have one car. We have a van between the 5 of us to do our errands. If something happens to the van, that's it. We don't have the wherewithal to get something else. And I really don't want you driving like, all your friends around in this van. And they're like, okay. And I said, look, here's the deal I'll make you. And if you can turn it down, that's fine. But if you accept it, here's what it'll be. I will buy you a new bike when you're 16. We'll get you a bus card. We'll keep it fully funded. And I went to the insurance agent and said, okay, what is the monthly addition to our bill? And he gave us the number. And I said, okay, I will just give that to you in cash in a month. And that's the deal. And they all took it hands down. They're like, I'll take the deal, Dad. So when they turned 16, they got a fully funded bus card that was filled every month. They got a new bike, and then they got about, I don't know what it ended up being, like 50 or 60, $70, extra allowance. And the funny part about it was they ended up being the most free kids of all their friends. They weren't tied down to when was the car available. They were able to do things that no one else could do. And the story I tell in the book is, my son, Glenn, my oldest son, there was a march in Minneapolis against gun violence. And so he was part of it, and he was marching downtown, and then he gets to City Hall, and the march is over and everybody else is heading home. And then the mayor comes out and says, hey, we're going to invite everybody who wants to stay to come in and have a conversation with the city council members, and we can talk about gun violence in schools. And all of his friends said, well, we got to go home. The cars, it's parked, the parking meter. And Glenn's like, hey, I'm going to just stay here and I'll catch the bus home. And he was able to do things like that all the time. And here's the thing, that they're in college now, my two oldest, and they still don't have their driver's license. So,
oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Is there anything you got from writing the book and putting all of your thoughts down in one place? I mean, I imagine that you've put them down in separate places, but I'm wondering if there's something that revealed itself to you as you were putting this together.
Well, one thing was just, my MO usually is like, how hard can it be to do this? When I start something and I realize, well, this is a lot harder than I ever thought. That was one thing I learned, that writing a book's a lot tougher than I thought. But I think I was more energized by putting all this together. It was during the pandemic. I'd started this. I'd submitted the proposal before the pandemic started. And I thought, well, I felt pretty good about it. And then, after a month or two in the pandemic, I started wondering, is there even going to be faith communities to return to when all this is through? And I was pretty depressed about it, kind of hopeless. And a friend of mine just said, hey, just start writing and see what happens. So I just kept gathering all this information and writing it. And I came out of, when I finished this book, more hopeful than I've probably ever been, and kind of seen it in its totality, that, the church can be more localized, that it can reach its neighborhood, that it can be part of the neighborhood again. And that really energized me. I felt a lot more hopeful seeing it together in this way than I had being like kind of the disparate parts that I just had kind of strewn all over my office.
And what's been the response so far? What have folks said back to you about the book and about reading it and thinking about it?
Well, the response has been better than I thought. I mean, I thought, okay, my mom will probably buy a copy, my sister will buy a copy, but there's been actually quite a few copies sold. And the part that's really interested me is that it's not all been church people. You mentioned the church parking lot. I got more responses from that article from non-church people than I've got from anything. And that really surprised me. I wasn't expecting that at all. The best emails that I've got so far have been people that said, hey, your book inspired me to get on the bike, and I oiled my chain, and I'm riding. And someone else just put that they set up a little table outside their church, and they're going to have, they're having coffee. They just put out a coffee pot and they had a couple of chairs, and they're just going to see who walks by, and they're going to start talking to them. Or another person said, I used to take the bus, but since I retired, I haven't taken the bus. And I'm like, why am I not taking the bus more? So they're going to start taking the bus. So when I hear those things, I'm like, okay, we're onto something here.
What's next for you? You've written the book. You have, all of your work that you're doing. I imagine you're pretty busy. It seems like it from reading it. What's next? Do you have another book in store?
I have a children's book that I'm working on. It's just a
nice
picture book. Mr. Rogers, who I think is the patron saint of urbanism. And oh, yeah.
The neighborhood trolley. I got that in Pittsburgh when I was at a Revolution. A friend gave it to me.
I got a story from a former parishioner who told me that she was in her, I don't know how old she was, maybe in her 40s. She was sick. She didn't have kids. And all she could do is lay on the couch. And somebody would turn the TV on and just leave it on that channel all day. And she said it was Mr. Rogers would play like 3 or 4 times during the day. And it healed her body and soul, she said, just by watching this kids show all the time. So I love hearing those stories. But Mr. Rogers and this person named Henry Nouwen, who was a theologian, they were friends. And they just had such a relationship that I want to write a book. I'm writing a children's book about their friendship. So I'm hoping to still work in bicycling in the book, but there's a couple of pictures I have of them. The other part I've been thinking about is, okay, what's next? Now, when I wrote this book, the 15-minute city was obviously popular, but I think it's been more popularized in the past even 3 years. And I'm hearing I'm getting some feedback from some more stories of people saying, okay, how do we be more connected to our community? I don't know. I've just been collecting the stories I'm gathering so far. What does the church on the move look like? I think that might be something. I'm just having fun hearing this stuff.
The 15-minute church?
Yeah. I mean, all that's an ancient, I mean, that was what a parish model was.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about anything new. I'm just repeating things that are maybe been hidden for a couple hundred years.
You mentioned Notre Dame burning down. I was actually in Paris that day.
Wow.
Which is pretty crazy. We got on a train and went north. And then when we got to our hotel, we saw all the news, and it was obviously a national tragedy. But reading about it since then in National Geographic and other things that I come across, it's interesting to see how much the church it's a national icon, not necessarily as much of a religious icon as much anymore, but it's something that people in France relate to as something of national pride as opposed to maybe religion. And it's really interesting to see that maybe that transformation over time and thinking about how the local parishioners, offices and churches worked in that time period and how, there was basically this mega center, in central Paris. It's interesting to think about how kind of churches have evolved over time as well.
Yeah, I think there are little Notre Dames all over the place in neighborhoods. Some neighborhood churches kind of fulfill that role. Even if people never consider it themselves as religious people or even attend a service there, it still holds a little bit of significance in their life. If for anything, it prevents a parking lot from being there, right? Hopefully, or it's a place where there's some silence, or maybe they like the bells, or there's some music that's offered. We took a walking pilgrimage from Melrose to the Holy Island in Scotland and Northern England. And what I was amazed at was just, all these little village churches along the way, they operated more as just community centers. The doors were always open and they had a coffee pot always available and people would just go and sit in them. When we went to Newcastle, it was every day at noon, there was these organ concerts and I would go and talk to people and none of them were there for the religious part. They just wanted to hear the music. I think there's places for that.
Yeah, when I was in France, there was so many amazing stained glass images, and it was funny. We were talking about it, and the stained glass is actually kind of like the original comic book, right? And it was just trying to explain religion to the folks who might not have learned how to read yet, and so it's just like this is the story, and it was beautifully done, and it's really fascinating to think about it that way, right? As opposed to just like this art, it's actually a story to be told to folks about their religion. Yeah,
and rich symbolism all the way through.
Yeah, very beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Travis, where can folks find the book if they want to get a copy?
I mean, you can buy it directly from the publisher, judsonpress.com. And luckily, it's now at IndieBound and Bookshop. You can find those. I'd rather you go to your local bookshops if you can, order it through them. It is available through the Megalomarts, but I prefer you to stick to the Judson Press or the local bookshop if you can.
That's a good way to go. I did see that it's actually on sale on Bookshop, so if folks want to go there and get it.
Oh, even better. Look at that.
Yeah. As of today, I don't know how long that lasts, but well, Travis, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. I love the Overhead Wire, and I really appreciate the work you do, and just glad to be a part of the conversation. Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com, and you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.